Hello, dear foodie friends, and welcome to Kitchen Chat. I'm your host, Margaret McSweeney, and I'm so glad you're joining us here in the beautiful Middleby Residential Showroom in the Merchandise Mart, here with my favorite foodie friend and co-host, Chef Jaime Laurita.
Still here, Margaret. Still loving every minute of it.
Oh, and we are thrilled for you to get to know truly a culinary icon in Chicago.
That's for sure.
Yes, Chef Michael Kornick. Welcome to
Thank
Kitchen
you.
Chat.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, Jaime, he has had such an illustrious culinary career here in Chicago and New York. Where did this all begin? What put you on the path?
You know, I started cooking at home with my grandmother. She lived with us from the time I was born, and my mother. I refer to them as sort of glorified holiday cooks. But they took a lot of, pride and passion in bringing family occasions to the table with joy and love. And so I started cooking at a very young age. I liked the creative aspect of it, and I also was interested in business. I was interested in trying to find a way to make my way,
Right.
and become economically independent. So the two seemed to work together. My parents were restaurant goers. They liked the idea of restaurants and that experience, and so I was exposed to going out to eat in casual restaurants where I grew up. And when I started to become of age where I could get a job, I took a job at 15 years old, washing dishes and then bussing tables and then cleaning lettuce and chopping mushrooms.
Were you?
And that kind of thing.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I do.
And were they as interested or not?
No, I have three older sisters.
Okay.
My mother was sold residential real estate. My father was in the carpet industry, but it didn't have anything to do with my family background. And but I was really lucky. I mean, I really think that you have to be in sort of the right place at the right time.
Sure.
And I came of age at a time when American culinary arts and American chefs were not just beginning to get some recognition, but beginning to find a voice in a bigger culinary world. Alice Waters had opened in the early 70s. Larry Forgione opened An American Place in 1977. Jonathan Waxman relocated to New York from Michael's in Santa Monica to open Jams in 1979. And so being a young person interested in learning, it was a great time to think about honing my skills in restaurants that were really actively pursuing something special, something that people believed was going to be important.
Yes, and Chef Jaime, you two share something in common. I
What's
don't know
that?
if you know about you both.
We both know how to chop an onion.
You
It's
both
perfect.
trained at CIA.
We did. That's right.
Yeah.
The Culinary Institute of America. What
Yeah.
year did you graduate?
So I graduated in 1982.
Okay.
And, I think, again, this was a time of great transition for the Culinary Institute of America. The American Bounty was going to become the flagship restaurant,
That's right.
celebrating American cuisine. It was scheduled to open with the class that was going to graduate on June 14th or 15th in 1982, and I was the last class before that. So I didn't get to experience that restaurant, but what I did get to experience, because I was really active in extracurricular things, was a lot of the chef-related testing and practice identity of what that restaurant was going to be. Because senior class people, so let's call it the last 200 blocks, so five blocks or 4 blocks of people who weren't going to get to go to the Bounty, were invited during their off time to participate in some of the things that were going on around it. I moved to New York as soon as I could afford to, and I had an amazing experience. I worked at a restaurant which it was called the Quilted Giraffe.
It was my husband's and one of our favorite dates. I still have the little plastic quilted giraffe from there.
stir
and
stick.
it was extraordinary.
It was an extraordinary restaurant. And so, interestingly enough, and I tell this affectionately to my mother who passed away a few years ago, but also to just her energy for finding a way to help a kid. And so I applied to a bunch of places for my apprenticeship and didn't get a job. And so my mother went to a restaurant that she knew the people. And the first day of my apprenticeship, the chef said to me, "We only hired you because your mother's a friend of ours." It was like that felt good. But she had been to New York in in the early 80s, 81 or so, and she went to the Quilted Giraffe and she met Barry and Susan Wine, and she told Barry Wine this story, which Barry and Susan would affectionately share back, that my mother told him, oh, my son is going to be a chef and I'm sure he's going to want to work here. And lo and behold, I didn't know that conversation took place. I knew they had eaten at that restaurant, but when I was looking to move to New York, I was looking for a unique environment. I was looking for an environment that had, at that time I had shifted, I was very interested in American cooking, even though I had trained with classical French and Italian guys. But I was looking for something that was interested in American cooking. I was also looking for something that was going to be the next step up in terms of high end. And I was looking for a place where I thought, consistent to my other beliefs about where to work, I was looking for a place to work where the chef was interested in teaching. And that was really when I say I was lucky, I worked for a handful of chefs who were selfless, and they every day came into that kitchen trying to teach every single person who was willing to learn more about our craft.
Wow.
Wow. So who do you think most influenced you in your culinary and cooking techniques?
Well,
Is there a chef that
day in,
really
day
inspired
out,
you?
I think working in the space of the Quilted Giraffe, Noel Comas, who was the chef at the time, Mark Shad, who was the chef I went to work for, incidentally, as soon as I got there, I moved to New York and then I arrived for my first day to find out that he had resigned and was leaving. But Noel Comas was taking his place, and Noel owns Tomcat Bakery in New York now and has for a couple of decades, and he was a terrific chef and mentor and advisor. And then Andrew Spar was the chef who I apprenticed for at the Tremont Hotel in Crickets. I went to work for him at his own restaurant in Chicago. I moved to New York a year later and then moved to New Orleans in 1984 to open the Windsor Court Hotel, where he was the executive chef. So I worked for him 3 times. He had a great impact on me. Outside of that, there were chefs who were doing work that had a great influence on me. Alice Waters being one of them, Wolfgang Puck, Bradley Ogden, Jonathan Waxman, Jeremiah Tower, all chefs who I had the chance to work with in stage in their kitchens many times. My general path was work a lot, save a lot of money, fly to LA or San Francisco, work in restaurants in LA and San Francisco, and go back, to either New York or New Orleans or Chicago, where I was living at those times. I had a chance to go and stage at several restaurants in France as well, and I think French chefs would have had a bigger influence on me as individuals if I didn't view it as a collective.
Right.
When you at that time, in 1983 and then again in 85, when I went to France and staged and was set up by different chefs and people here, I was doing a sort of circuit of great chefs, like the greatest restaurants in the world, one could argue at the time. But they all said, in my mind, they were a collective of the French chefs, And to be fair, the cookbooks that they had written, which were very much collections of brilliant recipes that got them where they were not philosophical at that time. If you look at Bocuse's book, Trois Gros' first book, George Blanc's first book, Girard's books, they are great collections, but they lacked a certain story of the evolution of those spaces. Whereas when you think about Judy Rogers' book, you think about Keller's first book, you think about John George's book, Simple Cuisine, even though he's a French guy cooking in America, Starr's cookbook and things. And Wolfgang Puck's cookbooks too, as an Austrian who really embraced America immediately, and he came from Maxime's of Paris to Indiana. And no French or European national should have to relocate to Indiana, right? Because his head must have been spinning, right? He's leaving Paris, sous chef at Maxime's of Paris in its heyday, arguably 70s, moves to Indiana for a chef's job, and by the luck, Patrick Masson finds him and sweeps him up and takes him to California to do a restaurant called Ma Maison. Yes. And really, Puck will tell this story because I've heard him tell it before. he fell in love with what was going on in the marketplace there, right? Because it was really early on in terms of what we would consider farm to table. Alice was doing it along with all the people who came out of Chez Panisse, Mark Miller and Jeremiah and Jonathan. Santa Monica Farmers Market was something that hadn't even started up as an official place, but he found growers and producers, and then he found this Latino population, mostly Chicano and Mexican immigrants, who introduced him to this whole world, from cilantro to peppers and things that he hadn't experienced, and he fell in love with it. It was an exciting time.
Did you ever get a chance to meet Julia Child? And if so,
I did.
any
Do you
fun?
know that secret question? So I knew Julia very well. I used to have breakfast at her house in Cambridge. In 1991, I took the chef's job at the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston. I replaced Mark Baker, who came to Chicago to open up the Four Seasons here. And at that time, the James Beard House and Foundation didn't exist at that time, but what did exist was the American Institute of Wine and Food. And the American Institute of Wine and Food was the chairs of it were Robert Mondavi on the wine side and Julia Child on the food side. And they had organizations in cities, and when I was the chef at Gordon Restaurant in Chicago in 1985 through 87, I was part and parcel to what Gordon was doing in his involvement in the American Institute of Wine and Food. The first conference on gastronomy that American chefs gathered in 1984 in Philadelphia, I was lucky enough to go to, and Gordon actually found me at a conference of Who's Who in Cooking in America in 1985. He met with Barry Wine, who was the owner of Quilted Giraffe down in Florida, and he introduced me to Gordon, and that's when I came back to Chicago. But when I got to Boston, the American Institute of Wine and Food were doing the things that they were doing in other cities, but they were expensive. An event was $40 or $50, and young cooks couldn't afford that.
Right.
And so a bunch of terrific chefs got together in Boston, and we founded the Educational Foundation of the American Institute of Wine and Food as a low-budget way that we could educate young cooks on food and wine. Great idea.
Yeah.
We had no money. The AIWF leadership didn't want to really give us that much money. So we decided to do events that were sponsored by our vendors. So at Four Seasons, you buying stuff, you could call your importer of interesting goods and say, we want to do an olive oil and olive event, would you sponsor it for young cooks? And so we did all of our events for $5.
Wow.
But we also had no meeting place. And so Julia let us meet in her kitchen.
No.
And that was
wow.
the most magical space you could imagine.
It's almost
And
like
so
it's almost like when I'm listening to you talk, you're like a book I want to read.
Well, so I've been
Yes.
thinking about this
Yes.
idea for a long, long time, that I think I have something to say that relates to recipes and the history of what my life at the stove has been like, because I just kept tripping over these wonderful experiences. Ended up getting to know Julia, and she was the sort of guest of honor at my going away party from Boston. I cooked her 80th birthday party in Boston at the Four Seasons, and then cooked it again because she went on tour that year.
So crazy.
For her 80th birthday at Marché, which I opened in December of 1993, and her birthday party was celebrated into 94. What was really the most amazing thing, I think, in memory, and I will say that those cookbooks probably didn't receive the attention from chefs until the film and until the book, with Julia, because I think that reignited a sort of interest in what did she do all these years before public television and things. But I really grew up watching the show on public television. I'd make my father drive me down to Greektown to get a striped bass and oregano, or drive me to Chinatown to get a duck and things like that. And so, but the amazing thing about Julia is she had the most enthusiasm for things that she had never seen, things that she had never experienced. She was a huge proponent and advocate for what young chefs and young cooks were doing. She was always looking for a new restaurant, always looking to tell a young cook something that was rich, important advice coming from someone who had experienced cooking and traveling throughout the world.
I wonder what Julia would think today of what's happened to culinary in general.
I don't think anybody back then. I think you can go back to the chefs who were coming out of the Escoffier kitchens in the turn of the century, or go back to Carême in his glorious time. I think everybody would be pleasantly surprised at the willingness that diners all over the world have embraced learning and eating foods that don't necessarily come from where they came from.
Right.
I think they would embrace the enthusiasm that young people have for learning the trade. You know, this trade was not thought of as an ideal occupation in this country for a long, long time. The Culinary Institute, as you know, was founded by Anne Roth in order to be a vocational training for people coming back from World War II. That was not where, you know, kids growing up in affluent parts of New York were running to go to school. It was a vocational school that was serving a purpose for a trade that needed people to work. And I think if you look historically, 1959, when the Four Seasons restaurant opened, they worked really hard to find European chefs to manage that kitchen.
Amazing.
But some of the really wonderful people who became instructors in both Johnson & Wales and Culinary Institute of America, French Culinary Institute, who worked in some of the most important restaurants of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in New York City, came out of that restaurant, right? And that restaurant was the sort of space where these things were done at the most elaborate way, and not identified as a French restaurant.
The history that
Yeah.
we are partaking here. I do hope you write a book. We will
No,
be
for
the first
sure.
ones to get that.
You know, the
but
good ones,
but-
all the good books are written by people who really, and they've really dedicated sort of like a day a week for at least a year, time-wise. And I used to have this discussion with lots of chefs who figured out the timing. I had two of my own children. I adopted two children. I wanted to be a different attendance. I wanted a different attendance record as a parent than my father had. He was a traveling salesman. He was on the road a lot. So I didn't have the time then. But I certainly didn't have the time then.
Right.
And then when the kids were out of the house, they're all adults now, and I started to have the time, I got busy with other things. And now I have the time again, and so I've been trying to spend some time in kind of thinking about that process. The great cookbooks that really resonate with me are either the ones that tell a succinct story that's really worth reading, or they're the ones that have all the earmarked pages because someone's really found joy in using it a lot.
Giving me goosebumps.
And you know, I think of Ottolenghi's books, you know, as the most thumb-marked books in our house, because my wife's pescatarian and she loves the complexity of trying to make, you know, I'm joking. I'm sure someone's going to write and say, no, he has. But, you know, he'll have 11 ingredients in a vinaigrette, 15 ingredients in a vinaigrette. And my wife loves that process of gathering a bunch of ingredients like Japanese ume, salted plum, to accent a dish that's very much about Ottolenghi's Middle Eastern Israeli heritage of ingredients for a salad and things. And I think that, you know, when I start to look at the collection of recipes that I would want to be part of a book, when I start to look at my own history, I scratch my head not knowing where it fits in.
Yeah,
I
sure.
think yours would be very much earmarked. And I also love, Chef Jaime, that Chef Michael has a heart for charity. Can you tell us about the
Well, we
celebration
do a lot of
Chill
stuff.
and
So,
what you're doing on
yeah,
November
and even
14th?
you know, Chill, which is certainly a wonderful event that we're going to participate. Our presence in the Mart at Marshall's Landing has been a joyful relationship with ownership, with management, with all the showrooms that are here, with getting a chance to be part of their greater vision. Almost every fundraising event, right, that of any scale has food as an element. Chefs are often eager to help and participate. When you can have, you know, a chef like Paul Kahn come cook in your home,
Right.
that's an auction item that people are willing to pay
Oh, yeah.
thousands and thousands of dollars for.
Yes.
And that impact can be really great for charity.
Yes, and the impact for Chill, it's so exciting. And they've raised $1.85 million over the years, and I know Marshall Landing has been such a special part of that, and we're just so excited about your participation.
So I just have to ask, you're in our showroom. Thank you for coming in today, and it's the Viking La Cornue showroom. What is your kitchen like at home?
So my kitchen is what my wife would consider a proper expense for a midlife crisis. So I'm 57. We bought the house in 2013. Early 13, we moved in mid 15. It was a gut job of an old 140-year-old row house in Old Town. All the joists and the floors were rotted, so it was just, I had a clean slate. When I first went to France in 1983 and I saw La Cornue stoves and some other beautiful stoves, but I really fell in love with the way that the enamel finish, the brass and stainless came together to be really an artistic piece, which wouldn't have been enough. It's also has spectacular ovens. It has a dome stone oven, so you get radiant heat, so you can roast and caramelize without sometimes having to turn and things. And different than a convection oven, which is moving air, this sort of, there's no wind here. There's no, so you can do that same intense circular heat on something very light and delicate that you don't want to blow around.
I'm so glad that you have a La Cornue kitchen, because I recently did a demonstration at one of our dealers, and I explained that cooking on La Cornue is like being able to play a violin.
Wow.
It's like, it's so soft. Everything about when you're turning up the flame, it's just so soft.
Well, there's also, as you know, and Viking, we're sitting right in front of a beautiful Viking range, is doing the same thing, is giving people an awareness of what size pots do I cook in and what's the right size for an open burner to not have the impact on the sides of a pot of sauce I'm trying to reduce, or not have, for the just sake of wasting a lot of energy outside the burner space, that we're not going to get that connection to the pot and pan we're using. And you can custom design a La Cornue and Viking stoves too, to have a French top, to have a large burner for things like pasta water and other things, and to have the smallest size burner, so that if you live as we do as an empty nester, I don't have to use a large pot with a large surface area to accomplish the heat transfer that I want.
Right.
And so those three things link together to allow you to get pleasure out of your stove. Right. I always think when I go to cook in someone's house, they're always apologizing before I get there. Like, oh, I hope my kitchen has enough that I said, don't worry, I'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And I think chefs enjoy the challenge of, getting an 18-inch by 10-inch hibachi and being out in the woods, making something beautiful.
The Middleby Corporation, which now owns all of these brands, really focuses on performance. And having a chef like yourself own a La Cornue, and mentioning Viking as a brand specifically, you can see right in front of you that these are burners that come right off of like South Bend. Middleby owns all of these companies, and they've injected a lot of the parts and pieces into the Viking brand specifically.
And I think what's the biggest transition I've seen in all of this equipment is that if you had a home commercial stove line in your home at the early onset of them, the burners to get the power that we wanted were completely open. And so if you had a spill or a boil over, you were really hard pressed to clean. Now, with technology, with the right diffraction sizes of these burners, we're getting all the heat we could possibly want for the right size pot. And if perhaps we have a little bit of an incident, these surfaces are super easy to clean and super fast, and they catch liquid. All the problems of a heavy-duty stove and difficulty to clean and take care of have been eliminated. And so today, I think, even for people who don't cook passionately all the time, so they might cook, once a week, or they might cook holidays, these stoves are now as easy to work with much more capacity
And capability.
than other types of environments, you know. So.
Well, I am just so thrilled that you came here for a kitchen
Me
chat
too.
today. Just such an honor.
It
Oh,
is an
it's
honor, but
definitely-
you know what? Talking to you, it's like we don't even have enough time because
I know.
when my brain is like colliding with yours right now, there's so much more I want to know. One of the main things, really quickly, is I want to know where you are today. Like, if you mentioned so many other great chefs and so many great people who have inspired you, but you've been an inspiration, and people have come to, you know, to your restaurants and have wanted to come to work for you. What's the one thing that you could say that defines you as a chef that you can share with someone maybe that's wanting to starting out in culinary, with the restaurant industry changing, bubbles bursting, brands expanding, single restaurants trying to stay valuable and trying to grow? What's the one piece of advice you can give somebody either in the restaurant business or in the chef business for success?
So the first thing I would say is there are lots of people right now who are really interested in cooking and finding a way to monetize that into a career. And that used to mean restaurants or hotels.
Right.
Today, it's a much broader opportunity. And so I would suggest that someone try to find what's right for them. So it might be a hotel, it might be a restaurant, it might be an independent restaurant, it might be in a cuisine that they really love. It might be that they want to live in a really beautiful place. So they want a restaurant job in Jackson, Wyoming, or wherever. And those exist in every pocket of the United States now that has a little bit of interest. You're seeing these beautiful, wonderful restaurants pop up in small towns all over the country, where we used to say, you know, that was kind of limited to the coasts. Right. I remember when Fred Freddy used to write for Gourmet Magazine, it was New York and California, as if there was nothing in between. Today, of course, if Fred were writing, he'd be writing about Charleston, he'd be writing about Atlanta, he'd be writing about places all over the country. So I think that's the first thing. There's tons of opportunity for anybody who wants to be in our industry. The other thing is, if you're really passionate about cooking, go somewhere where you can learn to cook. Because I think most people who come out of a place like Culinary History of America, Johnson & Wales College, and many of the other better institutions around the country will tell you that that is a very broad, very valuable education to be in the industry. But that really learning how to cook, you need to be somewhere with a passionate teacher, someone who's in the kitchen teaching someone how to cook. And I think there's lots of great examples of that. One of my favorites right now is called Grandma Pasta. It's a podcast that is just spectacular. And this is a woman who's going around Italy photographing people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, a 100-year-old woman making the family pasta recipe.
Oh, damn.
And it's a spectacular podcast.
I would love to.
So I think, again, for those people who are interested in succeeding in the restaurant business, the flip side of it is you better learn the business. It's an unforgiving business today. It used to be that people get into the restaurant business at a low entry point. You didn't need specific skills, licensing, et cetera. You could open a small restaurant. You could cook the food of your origin, right? This is how neighborhoods like Little Italy and Chinatown and all sorts of places like Pilsen it came to have all these wonderful restaurants that we enjoy. Is they came, they relocated, and they cooked the food from where they had come from for the people who would have an appreciation for it, both new and familiar. Today, the business is really challenging. If you know, I would say the first thing you need on your team is a really good lawyer, and the second person's a really good accountant.
Right.
And then you might have half a chance of getting your concept to fruition in a way that you have a chance to be successful. And again, I think there's tons of mentors in that area. You know, we have a ton of restaurant groups in Chicago that have had huge success. I learned the business at what I consider to be the best of them. It was with Rich Melman and Let Us Entertain You.
Gosh.
And they have
Your timing
just the best.
Your timing is impeccable. It's like from the time you graduated culinary school all the way through these years of evolution, you've seen it all.
Yes.
And you've been, but most people are not able to touch or be in the midst of people like Julia Child
Yes.
any longer.
Oh, I
That's
love
like
those
that's something of
memories.
who's the
her
modern
kitchen.
day Julia Child? Who's that person now?
I think that that those people today might be in their restaurants. If you look at the amount of people who've come out of Daniel Boulud's kitchens over the last 25 years who are running restaurants in New York. If you think about the amount of people who've come through the business side of Let Us Entertain You, who have both stayed with the company, one of their 70 partners or whatever it is, or who've moved on to open up companies like Billy Higgins and Bill Upson and Cindy Paulson, who did Mustard's Grill and all the restaurants they've done on the West Coast. I think there are people. There's not someone who's kind of in that authorship spokesperson space. Certainly Jacques Pepin is still busy and active teaching. I think his two cookbooks, La Méthode and La Technique, are the most important cookbooks any young cook can get their hands on. Right. And they're impossible to find, even on Amazon used, of the paperbacks and stuff. But they're full-blown illustrations of every technique that a young culinarian would want to know. Yeah. And so they're out there.
I feel like I have to say, and this is not me blowing smoke, but I think you're one of them.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm trying.
That's
trying.
That's for sure. I mean, I have to say, Margaret, in all of our kitchen chats, I feel like there's not enough time to even open up the onion here. It's like you have so much knowledge and credibility.
Yes.
It's just an honor.
I love our profession. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chef, for sharing your passion and all the stories and encouragement. And thank you, dear foodie friends, for joining us today. And please come visit Chef Jaime Laurita here in the Viking La Cornue showroom in the Merchandise Smart, Suite 137. And always remember to take a moment and savor the day.